My husband on the autism spectrum, he has high functioning autism, is very stubborn and is often angry. He also has severe anxiety. Is it possible that the anxiety is causing him to act out in various ways? Well, the short answer to that would be yes, pretty much 100% of the time. A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high functioning autism, and that's due to three different things really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavior rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan, or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to talk to the men out there on the autism spectrum who have anxiety. And if you're like most, as in like 100% of other people on the autism spectrum, anxiety just comes with the territory, right? But I don't want you to view anxiety as altogether a bad thing. Actually, there's a part of anxiety that is a good thing, even a survival mechanism. Now, we certainly don't want to have anxiety over everything all the time, but we are designed to have some anxiety over some things some of the time. So anxiety is actually a call to action. If you have some unresolved anxiety in your relationship, your anxiety is telling you that there is something not working quite right and change needs to happen. So it's good that you have some anxiety. If you don't have anxiety, you're either dead or you're a psychopath. And if you're listening to this video, you're not dead. And if you're not in prison, chances are pretty good you're not a psychopath. The message today is for you to view some of your anxiety as a call to action. It's a message that your brain is trying to send to you saying something is not functioning the way it can be and we need to change it. On that note, I have a men's group coming up for people on the autism spectrum who are having trouble in their relationships, and you don't have to have a formal diagnosis to join this group. So check it out, click on the link below. As you may know, if you have Asperger's syndrome, or if you live with somebody who has Asperger's syndrome, anxiety is a huge issue. I would say pretty much everybody who has Asperger's or high-function autism also by default has anxiety issues. And I want to talk briefly about that. You know, when you're afraid of, you can think of fear as you're afraid of something and you know exactly what it is. You know, you have to go to the dentist next week and have a root canal or have some other medical procedure done, or you have a job interview, or you're going to have to go have dinner with the in-laws. You know, there's some future event and you know that you know exactly what it is, and it does create a bit of angst inside of you. Then there's anxiety, which is you're afraid of something, but you don't know what it is. It's kind of mysterious. So if you are having anxiety, you're worried about something in the future that hasn't happened yet, and quite honestly, may never happen. How many times have you worried about something and the thing never happened? If you're honest with yourself, that's about 99% of the time. So, in this sense, anxiety is fiction. You're spending a lot of time and mental energy, which is exhausting, by the way, on something that doesn't exist. Think about this. Anxiety is nothing more than your thoughts. It's not something outside of you. If you're anxious about something, it's not some external thing that you need to be concerned about, some boogeyman that's going to get you. It's something inside of your damn head. It's inside of you. It's not something looming outside of you that you don't have any control over. It's inside of your brain, and you do have control over that. You have to learn that skill. It's not something you can just will yourself to do. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to train how to do various anxiety reduction techniques. And there are plenty of those. So, on that note, I have a few links underneath this video if you want to explore this further. Thanks, guys. This is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is, what's the best way for people with Asperger's to manage their anxiety? Thank you, Ken.
Well, in answer to the question, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach for anxiety, because what causes your anxiety might not cause anxiety for somebody else, and what alleviates your anxiety might not alleviate that anxiety in somebody else. So it's going to be a very individual approach to find out what works best for you. But let's make a distinction between fear and anxiety, because fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know, because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms, and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful. So she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of a husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. You know, maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset and she's kind of interrogating, and so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, you know, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shutdown or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, the best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. A meltdown can be viewed as consisting of three phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes, for example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on an emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all three phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter, and it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I often get a lot of neurotypical spouses wanting to inquire about why their partner with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism has meltdowns. And I got an email recently, and I get a lot of these, and in essence, this is a neurotypical wife, and she's wanted to understand more fully why her Asperger's husband has meltdowns. Before we can address that, we'll have to look at anxiety, because a meltdown or a shutdown is a result of high anxiety. And so you could think of a meltdown as simply a symptom of anxiety. If your husband, for example, who has Asperger's syndrome, goes into a meltdown or a shutdown, you can bet that what preceded that was something that raised his anxiety. We'll just call this the anxiety cycle, and a meltdown will be part of this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people with Asperger's to experience more than their fair share of stress. And honestly, to make matters worse, Many of these people lack the ability to manage their stress effectively. They've come up with some coping mechanisms to deal with it, and unfortunately, many of these mechanisms are dysfunctional. In other words, they kind of make a bad problem worse, or they solve the problem temporarily only. So, individuals with Asperger's are particularly prone to anxiety disorders as a consequence of the social demands made on them. Any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. Changes to daily routine can exacerbate the anxiety, and also certain sensory sensitivities can also contribute to that. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. They were fine the previous day, they wake up, they get started with their day, and for some reason they're anxious, and they can't pinpoint it. They can't attribute it to any particular event or something that somebody said or did. So not only do people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism experience anxiety, oftentimes it's random and for no apparent reason. Perhaps some of these individuals take life too seriously. Perhaps they take others' behavior and comments too personally. And perhaps they just generally view themselves as worrywarts, and so they've kind of labeled themselves that way. And so chronically worrying that something bad will happen or something good won't happen has honestly just become a habit. And that's an important concept. Once you have anxiety for a period of time, it actually becomes a habit, and it operates at an unconscious level. So that's the first thing that happens in this business that relates to a meltdown, is the anxiety piece. What follows then is the need for anxiety reduction, of course. Nobody can go through day after day, 365 days a week under high anxiety without having some kind of problem or searching for some kind of remedy. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, unfortunately, in many cases, their anxiety reduction techniques actually create more problems or further their anxiety or drive people away or can result in school suspension, job loss, divorce, and so on. So they do try to manage their anxiety in healthful ways. They think for example, distracting themselves by engaging in their special interest for excessive amounts of time. Some people turn to marijuana, some people turn to alcohol, various things, and some work to some degree, some don't work at all, and some only work temporarily. But the two main things that they do for anxiety reduction would be, of course, the shutdown, and that is where they just hibernate. They just want to be by themselves, and they withdraw, don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to temporarily take a time out and escape from the world. And then the other thing they do, the opposite end of the spectrum of a shutdown, would be the meltdown, and that's what we're trying to address today. So as this anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's literally the straw that breaks the camel's back. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected person with Asperger's may become totally out of control and have a huge explosion. And that's usually what people see when they see somebody having a meltdown. So those who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. I hear from neurotypical spouses all the time that their Asperger's husband only shows anger. When he's sad, it shows up as anger. If he's mad, it shows up as anger. If he's depressed, all he displays is anger. Even though they do have several emotions underneath there, they only show the surface emotion, which is anger. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas in life affected by Asperger's. There is often this on-off quality to the person's rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while the people around are stunned and shocked that what they just witnessed. And so in this case, the Asperger's man is, after he's had his meltdown, 5 minutes later he's fine, and everybody else is still going, what the hell happened, and they're still in a state of shock. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time. In some cases, the Asperger's individual may not even acknowledge he has trouble with rage, and he will blame others for provoking him. And as you can well imagine, this creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. There would literally be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this video here, we're going to just discuss the following example, and we'll apply this example throughout. So, let's say the Asperger's individual's had a rough day at work, but he was able to kind of maintain his composure for the most part through the day. But when he gets home, his wife makes a comment that she didn't think was particularly provoking or upsetting, but that hits the man wrong for some reason and he explodes. So in other words, he kind of takes out his anxiety that he experienced through the day. He takes that out on his wife. Unintentionally, of course. I mean, it wasn't premeditated. He didn't think on the way home, I'm going to give my wife hell when I walk in the door. But he was already in a position where he was about to explode. And it didn't take much more steam to blow the lid off of that kettle. So the next phase in this anxiety cycle is guilt. And we're going to use the example of the guy coming home from work, okay? So if this particular scenario plays itself out numerous times over months and years, in other words, it seems to be a theme or a pattern that he always comes home in a bad mood and to one degree or another takes it out on his wife. The Asperger's husband in this case will come to believe that he's the victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he loves. He may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, where he comes home and he knows he's taking out his anger on his wife when really it should have been directed at the coworker that pissed him off earlier in the day. But even though he tries to avoid the meltdown, he still has this work-related stress that's unresolved, and he hasn't figured out a way to deal with this stress in a functional, non-destructive way. So since he keeps repeating this same cycle that he doesn't want to repeat, he's beginning to feel very guilty about the whole damn thing. So what do you do when you have ongoing toxic guilt? Well, what happens next in this cycle is self-punishment. As a result of repeated social failures, in other words, in this case, numerous negative encounters with his wife, the person with Asperger's may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, he doesn't deserve compassion, he doesn't deserve to have a peaceful lifestyle. Therefore, he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, beating up on himself with negative self-talk, drinking or drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly even separation or divorce. In other words, he's the one that initiates separation or divorce because he thinks that he deserves that. Guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people with Asperger's who experience repeated exposures to this anxiety cycle that we're talking about here have unresolved guilt, which literally prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Instead, they're just trying to survive life, and they're just trying to survive emotionally. So the whole thing started off with anxiety. He tried to reduce his anxiety, in this case with numerous dysfunctional methods that didn't work. And so since he couldn't come up with an anxiety reduction method that worked, he went to the default meltdown. In other words, the anxiety built up so much that he couldn't even engage in any kind of hopeful interventions at that point. It was just explosion time. Then he feels guilty for these explosions. Then he punishes himself for these explosions, and we've gone full circle right back to anxiety again, because all of these different steps in the cycle are hugely stressful. So months or even years of experiencing numerous negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, and so on, obviously can make relationships so problematic that the better option becomes living alone or avoiding human contact as much as possible. In many cases, the man gets divorced and he just decides, I'm never getting married again. I'm never going to try this love thing again. I suck at it and I hurt people and I'm just better off left to my own company. But unfortunately, all of us are social creatures by nature. As human beings, we need other people. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety because people need other people. And so when he chooses a solitary lifestyle, he's by default chosen to make his anxiety even worse. So I think that describes the anxiety cycle that includes the meltdown business that we were focusing on. And there's some links underneath this video if you guys want to get a hold of me. If you're somebody with Asperger's syndrome and you need some assistance, or if you're the spouse of someone with Asperger's syndrome, be sure to click on the links below and get a hold of me and we will talk. Thanks guys. Mark Hutten, adultaspergerschat.com. She wants emotional reciprocity, she being the NT wife, neurotypical. But in pretty much all cases, and I work with men only, women only, groups of couples only. I have all the demographics covered, all the bases covered. And in almost all cases, the NT wife's approach to try to get you to be emotionally reciprocal ends up raising your anxiety such that you want to just disconnect from her, purely for anxiety reduction purposes, which yields the opposite result of what she's trying to do. And I'm not trying to blame her I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I will go on record as saying that her method of getting you to be a team player and getting you to connect and be more empathic and affectionate, her method of going about that has in too many cases driven you away, which makes, not to blame her, I mean, you have your share, you're contributing to the issues as well, but when you pull away, and in many cases, I got to tell you guys, in many cases, she has become his number one source of anxiety. She's come that far up in status as she is now my number one source of anxiety. I mean, I'm not saying that connecting with her is not important to you. It's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying her need for the connection is more important to her than it is you. And if she were here, she would say, you don't provide enough emotional reciprocity, that you don't listen. I'm just going to make some things up that you've probably heard. You don't listen, you don't empathize, you don't validate me, and so on and so on. You've probably heard it all many times before. And so if this has gone on for years and years and years, you may have experienced this too. She is super resentful and angry, and maybe even at some level revengeful. And so what has happened, and I'm not blaming you guys, you're wired the way that you're wired. There's nothing wrong with you. It is what it is. But by virtue of your supposed lack of empathy and her heightened resentment, we're going to call that a cancer in the relationship. So you guys, most of you are experiencing a relationship cancer right now, and you're in the middle. You've just begun treatment last week. Last Wednesday, you just began treatment. And so the whole point of this conversation is that you can, as much as I almost hate to say it, because it sounds kind of disconcerting at some level, you guys are in for the long haul. You have to be in for the long haul. This is not something we're going to resolve in a few weeks of meeting here. You're going to have to apply the assignments that we talk about. You're going to have to be consistent with it. And she is going to have to see some significant change. So there's actually going to be three things. It's going to have to be significant change. In other words, something that really stands out in her attention. It's going to have to be consistent change. In other words, change that remains consistent over time. And with those two things, a fairly radical change that she views, consistent over time, then and only then will she begin to reduce her resentment level. Right now, it's most likely that many of you guys are experiencing a thing where her heart is cold as ice. And she probably has lost trust. She's probably given up hope in some cases. And she's also probably reluctant to give you the benefit of the doubt so early, even if she does witness some significant change, because if she were here, she would say, well, I know there's been times before when he's changed, supposedly changed, but it never lasted very long. And it was just a matter of time before he went back to his old ways. So even if she saw some consistent change in you, a significant change in your empathy level, we'll say, she still wouldn't be necessarily willing to acknowledge it, because she would be concerned that if I start having hope again, and he lets me down again, I'm not sure I can handle it. So she may even be withholding affection or acknowledgement or praise or pointing out that you're actually doing something right for fear of being let down again. So everybody in here is in for a long haul deal. You have to be willing to tough this out and realize that this fix, for the lack of a better term, is not going to happen anytime soon. That's not to say you wouldn't see some improvement if you're doing the assignments. You should be able to see some improvement in her response to you, but it's not going to be anything real super observable or noticeable for quite a while, because again, she's going to have to see significant change, and she's going to have to see that spread out over the course of the next several months before she's going to have a change in attitude. And that change of attitude in her mind would be, you know what, he is making some significant changes, and he has been consistently doing so over the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe he really has turned the corner. So the general philosophy of people on the autism spectrum, and this is very generalized, by the way, is based in the belief system that people are largely just in the way of me completing tasks. People are mostly an impediment to me engaging in my special interest. People are mostly obstacles to me engaging in my self-soothing anxiety reduction activities. So based on that belief system, the inner dialogue or self-talk is usually along the lines of, I must be able to engage in my special interest as often as possible for anxiety reduction reasons. I need to be distracted with something pleasurable to escape the anxieties experienced in the real world. And I need to engage in activities that alleviate boredom, because most things outside of my special interest are painfully boring. So based on that self-talk, the emotion that's evoked is often one of frustration. In fact, it is exceedingly common, in fact, we will say 100% of the time, for people on the autism spectrum to have low frustration tolerance. Feelings of frustration are largely due to people getting in the way of completing tasks, disrupting their routine and structure, and imposing change on them, unwanted change. When this happens, the feelings of frustration can then graduate to anger or anxiety overload, the first of which may manifest in the form of a meltdown or tantrum, the second of which may result in a shutdown. So based on that particular belief system and the associated self-talk and the associated feelings of frustration and anger, behaviorally, the individual will appear rigid, self-absorbed, disconnected from relationships, and preoccupied with things. In other words, tasks, objects, facts, figures, and so on. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I have a message for the NT spouses. And of course, we know that NTs can be male or female. We know ASD individuals can be male or female. I'm going to use the example where she is the NT and he is the guy on the autism spectrum. And so she will often say, we still have problems. He's not improving. Nothing gets better. We're still having communication breakdown and so on. And then on closer inspection, I realize that she is continuing to treat him like a neurotypical. She continues to insist on approaching him as if he was normal. He is not normal. Stop it, okay? He's not normal. And the more you assume that he is going to respond to your neurotypical ways, the more frustrated you're going to be. You wouldn't treat a snapping turtle like a toy poodle, right? You wouldn't give a snapping turtle a bone. You wouldn't play catch with it. You wouldn't have it sit on your lap and pet it. You wouldn't take it to the groomers. You wouldn't take it for a walk around the park and so on. And the longer you treated this snapping turtle like a toy poodle, the more frustrated this turtle is going to get, to the point where he may snap, and now you're missing the tip of your thumb and you wonder what you did wrong. Here's a rhetorical question for you. Let's pretend that you met up with somebody from a different planet. And this person had a blind spot, a huge blind spot, with respect to how you think, how you feel, and why you behave the way you do. How would you try to communicate with that entity? How would you respond? How would you try to help? So in this example, let's say that you realize that this person from a different planet had this huge blind spot But then you took it on yourself to try to improve him, as if he shouldn't be wired that way. And in this scenario, imagine that the harder you tried to fix a deficit that you perceived to be a deficit, the bigger his blind spots became. And then it got to the point where this entity gets so frustrated that now he gives up trying to communicate with you at all. Because, ladies, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with somebody who has a huge blind spot with respect to what and why you think the way you do, what and why you feel the way you do, what and why you behave the way you do. And so when you take offense of that, and I'm not blaming you, it's easy to do, but when you take offense of that and try to get him to get it, you're treating your snapping turtle like a toy poodle. And it's getting tired of being dragged around by a dog leash. And the more you do this, the more that snapping turtle is going to get frustrated and snap back. Fighting multiple battles is making you physically and mentally sick. I run into all the time, really, neurodiverse couples who fight every battle that comes down the pike. Neurodiverse couples are notorious for just piling a bunch of disputes on the table without categorizing, prioritizing. They won't talk about how sex isn't good, the money problems, kid problems, quality time or lack thereof, chores are not getting done, or somebody feels like they're doing all the chores, and pet peeves, dirty dishes, the in-laws, and the list just goes on. And they're both just chasing their tails, quite honestly. And the problem with that is, if you are not judicious about which battles to fight and you just fight everything, then you become toxic to one another. And you get the two of you in the same room, and it almost always ends up in some kind of a debate or argument or fight, etc. The problem with this is people who fight every battle that comes down the pike also are in a lot of emotional pain. Chronic, low-grade emotional pain is what I call it. And those who are in chronic, low-grade emotional pain tend to perceive slights and disrespect where there is none. And if they are always on the alert for any sign of disrespect or lack of cooperation or a personal insult or being controlled by the other person, etc., they're going to be much more willing to continue to fight every battle that comes down the pike. So over time, they're fighting more and more battles, thus increasing the emotional pain, and you're in this cycle. So obviously, you would want to do the opposite of that. And my suggestion would be to pick the top 3 issues that you want to resolve. I'm not saying don't fight any battles, and I am saying you want to do fair fighting, but you don't want to fight every battle that comes down the pike. And so I would say pick 3. Just for starters, pick 3, but don't fight all 3 at one time. So brainstorm about the most important issues. Keep it to 3 just for now. Try to have some dialogue on one of those 3. And then when you get some resolve on one of those, then you can move on to the second one. Then you can move on to the third one. All others are not fair game for one damn comment. Let me repeat that. Anything outside of those top 3 is not fair game for debate, argument, discussion, etc. Pick your battles carefully. And if you choose to fight every battle that comes down the pike, you are choosing mental illness and physical illness. And if you're getting sick by fighting too many battles at once, hasn't manifested in mental health issues or physical health issues yet, give it a few years, and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So another common concern that comes up with NT wives about their autistic husband is she will say something along the lines of, he won't answer my questions. I'll ask him, what took you so long? He will say, I don't know. Or she'll ask, what are you planning to do with such and such? And he'll say, never mind. Or he just won't respond to her questions at all. And so what's up with this in the vast majority of cases is he knows that if he answers that question, that's just going to open the floodgates for a bunch of other questions. Or he's simply afraid to answer the question because he feels like he's going to get in trouble for the answer. So if you have asked him a question and then he answers your question, but then you follow that up with 12 other questions, he's going to download that as I'm being interrogated, this raises my anxiety. Or if you have asked a question and he gave you the answer and you didn't like it and then you had a problem with the answer and chastised him accordingly, then he's going to be gun shy about answering any of your questions. Or he is going to give you the answer that he thinks you want to hear just to get you off of his back. So one of the things that you could do in this case would be to let him know prior to asking the question that you're not going to be asking follow-up questions, or he's not going to be in trouble for the answer to the question. So you could say, I've got one question. I would like the answer to it. I promise not to follow that up with a dozen other questions, and I promise not to use your answer as an opportunity to get punitive or parental. So if he knows he's not going to be interrogated or criticized, he's going to be much more likely to answer your one question. If you're the type of person with high anxiety, you're constantly getting fooled into believing that there's something to be afraid of in the absence of real danger. Fear is when you're afraid of something and you know what it is. Anxiety, though, is when you're afraid of something but you don't know what it is. Anxiety is deceiving because when we feel discomfort, we get tricked into treating it like a real threat. But as the rational part of your brain knows, discomfort is not dangerous. When there is true danger at hand, we either freeze up, run, or fight back. If the threat looks faster and stronger than you, you may freeze up. If the threat looks stronger than you, but slower, you may run away from it. If the threat looks weaker than you, you may fight back. Unfortunately, for people on the autism spectrum, people are their main source of discomfort. And then their body gets tricked into believing that certain individuals are truly dangerous. And if this happens, they will either argue with the other person, which is fight, avoid the other person, which is flight, or they would feel intimidated by the other person, which is a form of freezing. Your natural instinct to protect yourself is what leads you to get deceived by anxiety. So why haven't you been able to see the pattern of repeated episodes of anxiety that never actually lead to a feared outcome? Since your worst case scenarios never come to fruition, why don't you gradually lose your unreasonable anxiety around these scenarios? Well, there's several reasons for this. You took protective steps and there was no disaster. Therefore, you started believing that these steps that you took saved you from disaster. But these steps that you took that supposedly saved you from disaster also cause you to worry more about the next dangerous episode. It convinces you that you were very vulnerable and must always protect yourself. The real reason you didn't experience a disaster is that such disasters are not part of fear or phobia. We're talking about anxiety disorders, not disaster disorders. You get through the experience because the experience isn't actually life-threatening, but it's justifiably hard for you to recognize that at the time. You may be more likely to think that you just had a narrow escape, and this leads you to redouble your self-protection steps. It's these self-protection steps that actually maintain and strengthen the deceptiveness of anxiety. If, for example, we think we just escaped a disaster because we went back and checked the stove 10 times, then we're going to continue to feel vulnerable and continue to feel the need for self-protection. When this happens over and over, we're going to get stuck in the habit of protecting ourselves by certain means. This is when chronic anxiety gets entrenched into our life. We think we're actually helping ourselves, but we're actually getting tricked into making things worse, and this is how deceptive anxiety is. For those of you who have chronic anxiety, you may have noticed that the harder you try to escape it, the worse it gets. The more you fight it, the more you're stuck with it. Thus, if the harder we try, the worse it gets, then what we need to do is to take another look at the protective steps we've been using. With high anxiety, we've been deceived into trying to protect ourselves against something that isn't dangerous, and this makes our anxiety worse over time. So what do we do instead? We allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling, as uncomfortable as it is. Know that this feeling of uncomfortableness will be short-lived and it will not be life-threatening. So you simply want to allow yourself to feel that emotional pain because, as I stated earlier, running from it makes it chase you. It will chase after you and bring out even more fear as you run for your life. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I have a message for men on the autism spectrum who are married to a neurotypical wife, and I want to discuss with you briefly what I'm going to call the anxiety scale for risky conversations. Now, the reason I say risky conversations is because there's times when she wants to approach you and talk to you about something that's important to her, but it may be a little on the heavy side or loaded with some emotionality on her part, and so you are at risk of doing some version of a shutdown or a meltdown. And as she talks, the longer it goes, the more your anxiety comes up, and so we want to let her know, you want to let her know on a scale of 1 to 5 where your anxiety is. So the anxiety scale ranges from 1 to 5, 1 being very low anxiety with 5 being very high. Now, you'll want to use this scale when she's talking to you about important and perhaps even stressful topics. So as she is delivering her message, you are keeping a check on your anxiety level and where you're at on that scale, 1 being low, 5 being high. Now, when you feel that in your estimation you've hit a level 3, you are going to have difficulty listening, understanding, and retaining her information, and you're going to be at risk of experiencing some version of a meltdown or shutdown or false agreement. False agreement is simply when you agree with her just to hurry up and get the conversation over with. So at level 3, it would be best for you to call a timeout, but let her know this is not a shutdown. You can say, I'm at a level 3, I'm having a hard time retaining your information. Your information is important to you, so it's important to me too, but I need to take a brief timeout so I can get back down to level 1 on my anxiety scale. Okay, so you're letting her know this is a timeout, not a shutdown, and we will resume this discussion. Now, this is going to help you avoid shutdowns and meltdowns because it breaks up her sometimes rather large message into smaller, more manageable bite-sized chunks. So let's say you've hit level 3. You let her know, I'm not tracking your information very well now. Let me go take a timeout. I'll come back when I'm at level 1. You come back down to level 1. You let her know, I'm ready to continue this conversation. And when you come back for round 2, if you hit level 3 again, just repeat the process. As long as she knows that this is a timeout designed to help you listen, understand, and retain her message, she's probably going to be open to that. As long as she knows this is not an excuse to have a shutdown and to avoid the topic. There's never a great reason to bring up the past, unless, of course, it's to reflect on a positive memory, something that the two of you did together that was pleasant. Short of that, however, bringing up the past basically poisons the present moment. Think of a moment in time. It's less than a second in length, right? So this video is only a few seconds old at this point. There's been dozens of moments within this time frame already. So the moment is less than a second in length. But when you bring up the past, look at the lengthy history of the past. It could be 5, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging a very lengthy recollection of pain into the current moment. When you bring up the past, you experience content memory, which is the hurtful things that were said and done. You also experience emotional memory. In other words, how you felt during the incident in question. So when you bring up the past, which is years old at this point, you're overloading the present moment, toxifying it. Think of it like this. You're eating a bowl of soup with the appropriate amount of sodium, but you decide you're going to take the whole salt shaker and dump the whole thing in there. Now you've contaminated it. There's no way you could eat it. It would make you sick if you did. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging in decades of hurt into the present moment, and where does that get you? What have you actually achieved doing that? In most cases, you have just created yet another painful memory. So when you bring up the hurtful things of the past, you're going to remember what was said and done. You're going to remember how you felt. It's going to instantly open up old wounds, and you have toxified or overloaded the current moment. You have dumped years of misery into a few seconds. Never any great reason to bring up the past. So guys, one of the complaints that your NT wife might have is that you don't engage in give and take in conversation. She may be sitting there in the same room as you and say something, and then you don't respond because you're not sure if it's something you should respond to. You may be thinking, well, that wasn't a question. It was just a random statement that doesn't require any kind of response from me. So here's the deal, guys. Anytime she says something, she's wanting a response. Every time she says something, it would be helpful if you would respond. And if you want to go the extra mile, not only just respond to her statement, but try to keep the conversation going. So if she makes a statement and you think it's just a random comment that's just not even really requiring a response, it requires a response. So respond, go the extra mile, and try to stretch that out into an actual give and take of conversation. You can ask an inquiring question to keep the conversation going. I cannot express to you guys how much this is important, because this is one of the main things that gets in the way of her feeling like she's getting emotional reciprocity. She will say, well, I say something to him, I get no response. Just silence. I get the silent treatment a lot, talking to myself. I might as well be a potted plant sitting in the corner with no opinions and no wants, needs, desires, expectations, and so on. So you have your assignment. You get it? Okay, then do it. He knows that he sucks at social skills because he probably learned that as a child. And so if you were a little kid and your parents signed you up for Little League or T-ball or whatever, and you just didn't have the knack for that, and you got benched, you just basically sucked. So you ended up kind of being the bat boy, and it was a terrible experience. You know, I'm never playing baseball again. I suck at that. I was never any good at it. They started me way out in the outfield, and then the coach wasn't even happy with me way out there, and he just benched me, and I just sat on the bench the entire season. So now that I have been benched by the coach, and I know that I'm not a good baseball player, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, would you like to join this team and learn how to play baseball? It's like, no, I've already been around that block. I suck at it. No. I don't have any interest in learning baseball or learning how to be a better pitcher or a better batter. And I'm perfectly fine not playing baseball. And so that's exactly what's going on with your husband, is that he knows he's terrible at it. He's had a bad experience with it. And talking is a social activity. Of course he doesn't want to talk. And it's a shame that he feels that way, because social skills can be taught. And the give and take in conversation can be taught. And he would actually get to the point where he would probably enjoy conversing, enjoy talking, because he's actually doing it fairly adeptly for the first time in his life. So he might even find some joy in having conversation about something other than his topic of interest. The two of you are wired so differently that it makes perfect sense why you would have this conflict. He's speaking French, you're speaking German. And that sets up all kind of problems, because with some of his traits, mind blindness, alexithymia, weak central coherence, some executive function deficit, he is wired such that her conversation style, which is very social and very emotional, raises his anxiety. And so he can't, for a variety of reasons that we will get into, it's hard for him to listen to a difficult conversation about the relationship problems. Since it causes so much anxiety, he engages in anxiety reduction, which could be meltdown, shutdown, pretending to listen but not really. There's a variety of things. And then she views that as he doesn't care about the relationship. I'm not important. He's insensitive, selfish, narcissistic, and all of that. So not to sound blaming to the NT wives in here, but your assessments of why he did or didn't do certain things or did or didn't say certain things was in many cases way off base. And he's way off base in his assessments of you as well, because with mind blindness, as some of you probably know, he, and I'm speaking in general terms here, has a hard time of peeling himself out of his skin, climbing behind her eyeballs and looking through her perception of things and getting a good grasp on why she thinks the way she does and why she feels the way she does and why she behaves the way she does and why she has certain opinions and perspectives. He can't do that. He can't put himself in your shoes and imagine what you might be thinking or feeling or why you have a certain opinion about stuff. And so since he's not sure, he will tend to fill in the blank with something just because he wants to try to make sense of her, and he always misses the mark. And it's even slightly worse than that because he will tend to fill in the blank not only with a false assumption but with a negative spin, and will assign kind of negative connotations on her motive. So a message to the NT wives out there: you are a caretaker by default. It's in your DNA, it's in your genetics, you're wired that way. You also have, if you're married to someone with ASD level 1, you have someone with a disorder that results in his emotional age being much younger than his chronological age. So either at a conscious level or an unconscious level, your mothering instinct kicked in with him, because there's been times when your, for example, 48-year-old husband behaved more like a 12-year-old. So your mothering instinct works great with your kids, but your mothering instinct also kicks in with your husband kid, and it doesn't work because you're at an unconscious level trying to mother an adult. In this case, it's mothering an adult who is emotionally more like a child, and that's confusing to your brain. Your mother brain feels like, I should parent this adult. So the point to this video is this: your mothering instinct is in your DNA. It works perfectly well with your kids. Unfortunately, when you cross the line and you do this at an unconscious level, and now use that same skill with your adult husband, even though he is emotionally more like one of your children, it backfires. That was Emma. Anyway, I wanted to let you know that I have groups. I'm surprised that people that watch my videos don't even know that. If you are struggling in a neurodiverse marriage and you're really confused about what the hell to do, I can help you a lot. I'm not Jesus, and I don't have a ton of magic bullets in my mystery bag, but I can certainly get you to a place where your marriage would be at least satisfactory. And I keep that neurodiverse couples group small. It's usually the case that it's the ASD level 1 husband with the NT wife. And that group is usually about 12 to 15. So that's going to be about 24 people total, only about 12 couples. You'll get a lot of one-on-one attention there. I do one-on-one sessions, but I'm booked up. So that's why I'm doing groups. But you will get a lot of one-on-one attention in the neurodiverse couples group. If your husband is not interested, I have an NT wives group. You can go to group with me. If you're an ASD level 1 husband and your wife's not interested in online counseling, I have an ASD men's group. If you are an NT wife and you feel like the marriage has caused a lot of mental health and even physical health problems for you, I have a Cassandra Syndrome recovery group. We meet 1 hour a week for 4 weeks, and there's really no reason not to do it. You've got nothing to lose. And the links will be in the description area below this video, and I've got a bunch of groups coming up soon. So I hope to see you then, okay? Thank you. You're going to have to let go of some of this. But I also know that that's asking you to bend over backwards. And a lot of ladies want to say, well, I can't bend over backwards. You need to practice. You may not be able to bend over backwards today, but if you practice, you'll be able to bend a little bit backwards. But you're not bending backwards for him. You're taking a very paradoxical, almost reverse psychology approach to dealing with this whole mess. And that is, less is better. Less work on him, more work on me. You can't fix autistic traits. You can't change autistic traits. You haven't been able to change him. You will never be able to change him. You've never heard me one time say, well, here's how you could change him. That's like me giving you advice on how you can change the weather. You're going to have to wake up and realize you cannot change him. And you're going to drive yourself, I'm going to drop an F-bomb so cover up your ears. You're going to drive yourself fucking crazy if you keep living like that. Some of you are halfway there now. Okay, so I felt like I needed to draw up a little graphic for you so you can see exactly what I'm referring to. This is mostly for the ASD spouses, although it doesn't hurt the NT spouses to hear this as well. But speaking of the NT spouse, we'll use the case where it's the autistic husband and the neurotypical wife. She understands that conflict is necessary and that disagreement is part of the program. And so this is not going to be a surprise to the NT wives. It might be a little bit of a new thing for the autistic husband, and that is this. Conflict is normal to a degree. Conflict is to be expected, and actually you want some conflict. Conflict is not altogether bad. You can't resolve a problem unless you identify the problem and discuss the problem. So a lot of guys on the autism spectrum view conflict as a disaster. They view talking about the problem as a personal insult, and like they're being attacked and criticized and being parented. No. If you're in a relationship with your significant other, conflict is going to be part of the program. It's okay. There's nothing going wrong. Now, there is such a thing as having no conflict, and the guys might be going, oh, great. That's what I'm shooting for, no conflict. No, you don't want to shoot for no conflict, because if you do, and you find that you're in a relationship where there's no conflict and you never talk about problems, that means you've given up. Both parties have given up. And at some level, they don't even care about the relationship anymore. It's no longer important to them because they know they're not getting anywhere in this relationship. So no conflict is a bad sign. On the other end of the spectrum, we have too much conflict, which is probably where the neurodiverse couple finds themselves today. Chronic conflict. We're always fighting. We're always finding numerous problems. We're always focusing on the problems, never solving anything. That's just as bad, but it's on the other end of the spectrum. Now, in the middle, somewhere, we have moderate conflict. There is such a thing as fair fighting. I know that seems like an oxymoron, but you can fight, you can argue, you can have conflict, you can discuss things in a very passionate, heated way because, both parties, or certainly one party, is discussing something that's very important to him or her, and that's fine. Moderate amounts of conflict yield results. Moderate amounts of conflict yield results because A, you're having some discussion, but B, you're not so wrapped up in being in the rabbit hole of chronic, constant conflict that yields no positive results that you're okay with having a fight every now and then because we argue. It was a tough moment. Neither one of us really enjoyed the discussion per se, but we arrived at some kind of a resolution. So if the end result is almost always resolution, I can handle the conflict. Moderate amounts, that is. So, conflict is okay. Conflict resolution will happen when you're in the middle of the spectrum here. So especially to the guys on the autism spectrum out there, don't view her talking about the problem as a personal attack, or that now she's out to get you, or that you've done something wrong, or that you are to be chastised. It's not a personal attack. She's not talking down to you. She's not criticizing you. She's wanting to fight fair to resolve the issues. There's toxic guilt, which is
I'm always making mistakes. I never get it right. I can never make her happy. I'm always making these social mistakes, which then causes toxic shame because I'm always making these mistakes. Therefore, I am a mistake. Now he's taken his behavior as an identity. That is toxic shame. I also don't mind speaking the truth, even though it's hard to hear. She hasn't always had your best interest at heart. Let's be very clear about that from the get-go. I think she has largely had your best interest at heart. If we want to put a percentage on it, which I think would probably be pretty accurate, 80 to 90% of the time, she did have your best interest at heart. The other 10 to 20%, she just wanted to let you have it because she was pissed. So let's make sure we understand that right up front. So that makes it, and I'm validating you and others in here who do indeed not trust their wife, because even though 80% of the time she was looking out for your best interest and was trying to do the right thing, if the other 20% of the time her message delivery raised your anxiety such that it resulted in you shutting down or melting down or engaging in false agreement, it's going to be hard for you to make the distinction. So if it's a mixed bag, which it always is, we're using 80 to 20 rule, it's hard for the guys to make the distinction between, okay, this is another perhaps good message with poor delivery versus, okay, this is probably another good message with good delivery. So you're already gun shy. Most guys are already gun shy about any conversation because just having the conversation in and of itself is a trigger. Just her saying, oh, well, I need to talk to you about something, boom. Just that in and of itself is a trigger before you even have the discussion, right? And I'm sure that she has lost some trust in you as well. So this is a two-way street. How can she earn your trust back? She needs to have good message delivery. If she was in my NT group, she knows how to do that now. The vast majority of times she's had a good message. Her intentions were good. Her heart was in the right place. Her message delivery stunk. But now she's learning about the disorder. She's learning about you specifically. She has new information now. And so she has no excuse at this point to not have a good message coupled with a good message delivery. And then, and only then, will you begin to trust her again. Also, another reason to perhaps extend trust first is she's not going to have mind blindness. She's going to understand other people's perspectives. She's not going to have emotions blindness, so she's going to understand feelings. She's probably not going to have any executive function issues. We'll say that the guy with ASD has a lot of blind spots when it comes to dealing with social and emotional nuances with his significant other. She will be able to see some of these things that you may not be able to see. She can be your seeing eye dog, so to speak. So I would encourage you to extend trust first on that point alone, that she's going to see some things that I simply am not going to see. And her line might even be, and probably should be, she could say, I see some things that maybe you miss, and would you be offended if, when that happens, I fill you in on what I see, and then you can take it or leave it. But yeah, I have some blind spots. Sometimes I don't see what I'm supposed to see or whatever. And if you fill me in tactfully, yeah, I'll be open to it.
Hey guys, this is Mark, and this is a message to both the NT spouse and the autistic spouse. This is not an exercise directed towards one or the other. It's for the both of you, and the exercise is this. I want you to consider getting out a piece of paper, or you can write it in a Word document on your phone or laptop. And on this piece of paper, I want you to list all the things that you don't like about your behavior. Not the other person's behavior, things that you don't like about your behavior, the things you say or do that you feel at some level are uncaring, insensitive, rude, hurtful, things that you say or do that definitely does not fall into the category of being compassionate or extending grace and mercy. And so list all the things that you view, in your opinion about you, behavior that you don't like to exhibit. things that you say and do that at some level you feel guilty or regret doing afterwards. Now, most people won't do this because they don't want to look at themselves, and most people want to dodge the truth. And so I fully expect hardly anybody to do this, but the one or two of you that actually will do this, you will find that it's very therapeutic, because then the next time you start feeling like a victim and start feeling sorry for yourself, you pull up this Word doc or pull out that piece of paper and look at all the shit that you do. Suddenly, you don't feel like so much of a victim anymore, because you realize, you know what? I'm inflicting as much pain or nearly as much pain on this person as I feel like they're doing to me. So, some of you will be too blind to do this exercise. You're so stuck in victim mode, and you cannot peel yourself out of your skin and turn around and look at yourself. No self-insight, in other words. And you wouldn't recognize rude, inappropriate behavior in you if it bumps you right in the forehead. So some of you won't do it. Those of you who can, who want to, here it is. List the behavior in you that you don't like about you. Then when you feel like a victim, the next time your spouse behaves badly and you go into poor me attitude, get out your list and look at what you do. This sounds like an exercise that would be counterproductive. I can promise you it is not. If you remind yourself that sometimes you're a perpetrator too, sometimes you don't start feeling so much like a victim anymore. Something to consider. Some NT spouses play the victim card, and some autistic spouses play the victim card. So again, I didn't have any particular party in mind when I did this video. It's a two-way street. Hey guys, this is Mark, and you've heard of the phrase, be here now? Be here now. Yeah. I'm going to be really paradoxical and suggest that you be somewhere else later. You've heard the phrase, live for the moment? No. Live for the future? You've heard of be present? No. I want you to be absent from the present. So what kind of knucklehead information is this? What is old news. What's going on now is often bad news. We don't want to focus on that. I want you to muster up your imagination skills, your visualization skills, your daydreaming skills, and focus on what you desire. Focus on a new and improved future, not on what's going on now. What's going on now sucks. So, yeah, be here now? No, I don't like that. I want you to be somewhere else later, not in the past. Don't go to the past. The past is done. There's nothing back there you want. I want you to be somewhere else later, as in the future. Focusing on visualizing, imagining, daydreaming on your preferred future, what you do want, what you do want. To tie this into the neurodiverse marriage, I want you to be focusing on, this is what I want us to be saying or doing at some point in the future. This is how I want us to be feeling about one another at some point in the future. This is what I want our thoughts to be about one another in the future. It's not focusing on what's going on now. You're focusing on what you want in the future. So, I'm going to say it for the third time now. Be here now? No. The hell with that. Live for the moment? No, I want you to live for the future. What is old news. Visualize, imagine, daydream on what you want to be, near future and distant future. Focus on that. All day. Here's an exercise now. Pay attention. I want you to get out a piece of paper or pull up a Word doc, and I want you to list as many things as you can regarding your preferred future. These are the things I want. These are going to be my preferred thoughts. These are going to be my preferred feelings. These are going to be my preferred behaviors. These are going to be my preferred outcomes. This is going to be my preferred marriage and all the dynamics involved in that thing. Okay? So do it. Get out a piece of paper. List the items that you want to see happen at some point. So I know this was kind of very paradoxical. It goes against the grain of what you hear in standard psychology. That's the way I live. That's the way I think. So consider it. Now, there are two exceptions to this new way of thinking and rather radical way of thinking, and that is when you're trying to connect with people that are important to you, you certainly want to be present mentally and emotionally. Also, if what you're doing in the present moment brings you satisfaction and joy, you certainly want to fully participate in that delicious moment. Outside of that, you want to be visualizing your preferred future. Now let's make the distinction between living for the moment and living in the moment. While I am saying we don't want to live for the moment, instead we want to live for the future, we don't have the choice of whether or not to live in the moment. We only have this current moment to deal with, and that's fine. So what to do with the living that goes on in the moment? I'm suggesting be available mentally and emotionally when you're connecting and communicating with others. If in the current moment you are finding joy and satisfaction, be sure to savor that. Outside of that, what you're going to do while you're living in the moment is you will be entertaining a vision of a new and improved way of life for you and your loved ones. Remember, what you think about the most becomes your reality. Now, let's expand this idea of visualizing an improved future to include your mood, your attitude, your behavior. Would you believe me if I told you that the main reason that you're so uncomfortable and ill at ease in this neurodiverse marriage is not so much because what your spouse is doing, but it's your reaction to your spouse that is the larger share of your distress. Why is that? It's because at your core, you are a very loving, caring, compassionate person. I don't care what you've been told by other people, and I'm talking to both spouses here, by the way. You are a loving, caring, compassionate person at your core. And so when you behave in ways that are out of alignment with your core, it feels very uncomfortable. Now, I'm saying that your spouse can say or do things that you download as very distressful. I'm not saying that they don't do anything. They do. But that's probably only 20 to 30% of your distress. The larger chunk of your distress is because you're out of alignment with you. You're behaving in ways that you don't like. You're becoming the kind of person that you don't want to be. And you're reacting in ways that are out of alignment with your true self. And you will find that when I behave reactionary, I'm out of alignment with me. And that's what's most uncomfortable for me. And so one of the best things you could be visualizing is playing the movie in your head of you saying and doing loving and kind things. And when you do that long enough, that type of attitude and behavior will be very obvious to others. And now you can imagine how greatly that will improve things. Okay, a quick message to spouses on the autism spectrum. I want you to stop what you're doing and send a quick message to your NT wife that says, in spite of the fact that we have difficult times, I still love you. Here it is again. In spite of the fact that we have difficult times, I still love you. Stop what you're doing right now. Either email her, text her, call her, or if both of you are home, stop what you're doing and go into the room that she's in and say it. Do it now, right now.
Always throwing the past in my face. There's two past things. Stuff that you can't change at this point, and past stuff that presently you could do something about. So if she's going to throw the past in your face and there's no way to go back and rectify anything on that particular topic, you're just going to have to be okay with her being pissed off. You can't climb in your time tunnel and go back and fix it. Now, if it's a past incident that you can currently do something about, then you use the line that we just said. Okay, well, I can't go back and erase that, but is there anything I can do about that today? With the first one, where you can't go back and fix it, let her be the one stuck in the past. You're just going to have to be okay with her being stuck back there. The past issue that you can do something about, just ask. Okay, well, I can't go back and erase that from our history. But is there something that I can do now, today? If the answer is yes, then now you have the choice to do something about it or not. Always throwing the past in my face. There's two past things. Stuff that you can't change at this point, and past stuff that presently you could do something about. So if she's going to throw the past in your face and there's no way to go back and rectify anything on that particular topic, you're just going to have to be okay with her being pissed off. You can't climb in your time tunnel and go back and fix it. Now, if it's a past incident that you can currently do something about, then you use the line that we just said. Okay, well, I can't go back and erase that, but is there anything I can do about that today? With the first one, where you can't go back and fix it, let her be the one stuck in the past. You're just going to have to be okay with her being stuck back there. The past issue that you can do something about, just ask. Okay, well, I can't go back and erase that from our history, but is there something that I can do now, today? If the answer is yes, then now you have the choice to do something about it or not. You have grossly underestimated how severe this is, and you have made a ton of false assumptions. I'm not important to him. He doesn't love me, doesn't care about me. His work's more important than I am. And you've made all of these evaluations and judgment calls. And I'm not saying he can never be insensitive. I'm not saying he can never be an asshole. I'm sure he can. But the other 90% of the time, the stuff that you wanted to label as insensitivity and selfishness and narcissism and so on was directly the result of one of the traits of the disorder. And this isn't to get him off the hook, by the way. He's very much on the hook. You could pick some random person off the street with autism, and he has paid the price for having these traits.
Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you.